Good evening, good morning, wherever you might be. My name is Ipek Taha, and I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers in Istanbul. A warm welcome to all of you for being with us at this real prime time when a new US president is being sworn in as we speak. We are excited tonight to be hosting this webinar, and I wanted to give you some background information and then let everything roll out and listen to our scholars. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has been hard on all of us. It has also been hard on the area of academic research, and especially young scholars in particular have encountered difficulties. Some of them have been deprived from their academic communities, and some have no longer access to archives and libraries due to the pandemic. Nevertheless, they continue to write and produce knowledge and inspire all of us with their dedication and meticulous research. Today, we are delighted to host three such brilliant young scholars who will present us their work on politics of archaeology. Before we start, I would like to say that as the Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, we're honored to bring this webinar series, Voices of Emerging Scholars, to you under the leadership of Professor Zeynep Çelik. Many thanks, Zeynep Hanım, who is not only a distinguished scholar of the Ottoman Empire, but also an enthusiastic scholar and teacher who's committed to inspire, raise, and mentor numerous students in many fields. Zeynep Çelik is a distinguished professor of Ottoman and Middle Eastern history and architecture at New Jersey Institute of Technology and a professor and adjunct professor of history at Columbia University. Her publications include The Remaking of Istanbul, winner of the Institute of Turkish Studies Book Award in 1986. Actually, the publication was in 86 and the award was in 87. Displaying the Orient, 1992. Urban Forms and Colonial Confrontations, Algiers under the French Rule, 1997. Empire, Architecture and the City, French-Ottoman Encounters from 1830 to 1914, 2008. Winner of the Society of Architectural Historians, Spiro Kostov Book Award, 2010, and About Antiquities, Politics of Archaeology in the Ottoman Empire in 2016. Professor Çelik is the recipient of the 2019 Giorgio Levi della Vida Medal, honoring outstanding achievement in Islamic studies. And she also has a new book out. Maybe she can tell us something about that. I would like to also mention the contribution of Merve Ispahani, who received her PhD degree in history from Columbia and who currently works as the academic programs coordinator at the Columbia Centers in Istanbul. As a young scholar herself, Merve puts her efforts into thinking various ways in which we can support students and scholars through our programs at the Istanbul Center. We believe in the importance of creating ongoing scholarly conversations on a global scale, and we cannot wait to hear more about the research of our guest speakers today. Let me leave the word to Professor Zeynep Çelik to introduce today's program on politics of archaeology and our speakers. Zeynep Hanım.
Thank you very much, Ipek Hanım, for this very generous introduction. I too would like to welcome our attendees to the first of our webinar series, Voices of Emerging Scholars. At the outset, I would like to thank Ipek Taha for inviting me to initiate this project. I'm very lucky. I found at the center a superb team, a smartest and most dynamic team that I could have imagined. We have been working happily for several weeks now, and it looks like we'll continue. I'm grateful to all of you, especially to Merve Tezcanlı İspahani, the academic programs coordinator, and Sedan Gürlek, who's hiding there, the program officers, and of course, to Ipek Hanım. As Ipek Hanım said, this is very much a COVID project. Life these days is grim indeed, but academic life is particularly grim. It's even grimmer for younger scholars. There are no job openings, no real conferences, no real professional meetings, no real lectures, no real classrooms, and Zoom is not an ideal substitute. Nevertheless, our Zoom webinars are intended to give some visibility to the work of younger scholars, their seriality helping to create a community of sorts. Judging from the number of responses we received to our call for proposals, I believe we hit a hot spot. Grouped around a common theme, we are organizing 1 or 2 panels per month for quite a while to come. Today's format will be followed in the others. There will be 3 presenters, and then comments from a discussant who will be a senior scholar, and finally we'll open the meeting to a question and answer period. I should add that the papers will be published in the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. We are grateful to Nüket Varlık, the editor of the journal, and Baki Tezcan, the president of the association, for accommodating us so graciously. Today's topic is a hot one: politics of archaeology. Political power has always relied on historic heritage. However, a major turn took place in the 19th century, and the two became thoroughly intertwined in an enduring manner, reaching to our day and certainly moving into the future. There are many developments and conditions behind the phenomenon. Let me list some key ones in no particular order. Development of archaeology as a discipline. Advances in travel technology. Think of steamboats and trains which facilitated the transportation of objects as well as archaeologists themselves. Photography. From the 1840s on, the history of photography and the history of archaeology became interlocked. Developments in cartography, very handy in documenting the sites. Then there is the explosion in venues to disseminate information, scholarly and popular publications, books, pamphlets, academic journals, photography albums, and others. We cannot forget the museums. Museums are 19th century phenomena, and they became one of the major public institutions in cities throughout the world. Then there is, of course, the money question, the monetary value of antiquities, and expansion of Western empires and colonialism. Very significantly, we should also consider the association of Western civilization with antiquity, 19th century Western civilization with antiquity, a phenomenon which had been going on for some time before the 19th century, but which had acquired an uncontestable legacy during this period. This claim led to an argument which has biting implications for today and which is widely contested: who owns antiquities? I could give you a longer list, but I will stop here and pass the torch to the presenters, who will address these issues in a multitude of sophisticated ways, all in 15 minutes each. As I introduce the speakers, I would like to draw your attention to their impeccable formation. the methodological challenges they confront as they blur the disciplinary boundaries, their complicated and multi-layered research, the range of sources they use, the multitude of archives they consult, and the languages they know. Today's group is Columbia heavy. All three presenters are from Columbia University. However, this will change from our next meeting on. We promise to bring in emerging scholars from a wide range of universities and geographies. Now let me go to the presenters. The first presenter is Erhan Tamur. Erhan is a PhD candidate in art history. He's also a curatorial research associate at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. He has worked and published on late 19th, early 20th century art historical theory, style and ethnicity, and the politics of archaeology. His dissertation is entitled Psych Worlds, an account of material lives from Tello, and it brings the art history of a Sumerian site from the 3rd millennium BC into the present. It is supported by a 2-year fellowship from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts of the National Gallery of Art. Our second speaker, Zeynep Çelik, is a PhD candidate in the Department of History. Her dissertation, titled Bloodless Battles, Contested Sovereignty Between the Ottomans, the Qajars, and the British in Ottoman Iraq, focuses on the myriad ways that Ottoman-Iraqi space was contested between these three empires in the late 19th century. She's currently working as a research assistant and co-curator for the Kaptan Foundation's Palestine from the Sky exhibition. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies, Jerusalem Quarterly, and the Journal of Philological Encounters. Our last speaker, Dotan Halevy, is also a PhD candidate in history. His research is centered on the culture, society, and politics of the late and post-Ottoman Middle East. He will defend his dissertation, which is titled Stripped, Ruination, Liminality, and the Making of the Gaza Strip, 1840-1950 in June. Dotan published articles in a variety of academic journals, including the Journal of Palestine Studies, the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, International Journal of Islamic Architecture, and the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. Finally, I would like to introduce our esteemed discussant, Diane Favro. Diane Favro is Distinguished Research Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA. Her long list of publications include The Urban Image of Augustan Rome, 1996, a very beloved book by both students and scholars of all levels. Recently, she wrote with Fikret Yegül an immense volume on Roman architecture and urban design, and that book is the winner of National Prose Award. She has numerous writings on ancient cities, gender issues in architecture, and methods of architectural history. Furthermore, she's an innovator of award-winning digital visualizations. Among various honors, she was named the Kazwa Samuel H. Kress Professor at the National Gallery, resident at American Academy in Rome, and Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians. Dr. Favro served as director of the UCLA ETC Digital Lab, President of the Society of Architectural Historians, and Associate Dean for the UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture. We are very grateful to you, Diane, for accepting
my
to
pleasure.
work with us. So now let's start with Erhan.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everyone. I'd like to begin with a few lines by the famous philologist Hermann Hilprecht on the French excavations at Tello in southern Iraq. He writes, in January 1877, Ernest de Sazec, a man of tall stature and expressive features, then about 40 years old, combining an active mind and sharp intellect with a pronounced taste for art and archaeology, and through his previous service in Egypt and Abyssinia, well versed in Oriental manners, and to a certain degree familiar with the life of the desert, was transferred to Basra as Vice Consul of France. According to Hilprecht and many others, archaeological research in the 19th century was a result of these individual heroic efforts of such diplomats, who put their pronounced taste for art and archaeology to good use in the free time they carved out of their consular duties. The earliest consuls were indeed actively engaged in archaeological exploration, but over the course of the 19th century, there was a dramatic shift from small-scale, sporadic explorations to large-scale, systematic excavations. In order to explain this shift, we need to look beyond the initiatives of individual consuls and towards the material foundations that sustained archaeological research through an intricate web of relationships, controlling land, people, and technologies. One of the chapters of my dissertation concerns such material foundations, and in this short talk, I'll highlight a technological development central to politics, commerce, and archaeology, the introduction of steamship services in Iraq. In the mid-19th century, at the time of the excavations at Nineveh and Nimrud, led by Austin Henry Layard and Hurmuz Rassam, the British representative in Baghdad was the famous Assyriologist Henry Rawlinson. Under his supervision in Mosul was the vice consul Christian Rassam, the brother of Hurmuz, who occasionally took over British excavations. In fact, both Hurmuz Rassam and Layard would later serve the British government as diplomats as well. The French vice consulate in Mosul was established in 1842 and first occupied by Paul-Émile Botta and then Victor Place, whose excavations at Khorsabat created an archaeological sensation in Europe. However, in 1855, the French convoy transporting antiquities on the Tigris was attacked and sunk, and the first phase of French explorations came to an end. The next phase would commence and conclude with Sazec, the last of the consul archaeologists. Archaeology was not only the most convenient way for an official in a remote Ottoman province to get recognition, it also became part and parcel of consular duties. Therefore, statements like Hilprecht's, considering archaeology a free-time activity, gloss over its historical and institutional underpinnings. For consular archaeologists who managed to secure governmental support, consulates worked as archaeological establishments. Similarly, it's not a coincidence that the first American representative in Baghdad was John Henry Haynes, one of the directors of the Nippur excavations, and that the opening of the first German consulate coincides with Robert Caldwell's excavations in Babylon. I believe that the primacy archaeological research attained in the job descriptions of diplomats is now clear. Now I'd like to move on to steamships by noting that in 1878, Layard, now ambassador, wrote to the Ottoman Sultan praising the role steamers played in the development of Iraq and recommending the extension of a railway line towards the Gulf. That railway, as we well know, was not completed under Ottoman rule. And I would argue that steamships fulfilled the role railways played in archaeological exploration in other parts of the empire. The first surveys on the Euphrates and Tigris for steam navigation were carried out by the British in the 1830s in order to find an effective route to India. A British initiative, the Lynch Company, founded by one of the captains of the survey ships, obtained permission to operate armed steamers. However, their high cost of maintenance soon led British authorities to propose their withdrawal to India. This is when Rawlinson, the consul in Baghdad, intervened, stressing how steamers not only secured commerce, but also helped maintain the geopolitical ambitions of the British government. Here he did not mention their role in archaeological exploration at all. Yet around that time, Rawlinson himself embarked on a journey to the Iranian border with Felix Jones, captain of one of the steamers, the account of which reads more like an explorative tour of various archaeological sites than a diplomatic mission. Moreover, in April 1846, Rawlinson sent Captain Jones upstream on the Tigris, again with utmost attention to the sites along the way. Although it was argued that the sole intention here was to establish friendly relations with tribes, the actual motivation is clear. Layard's excavations at Nimrud had begun a few months earlier, and Rawlinson hoped to assist him in matters of transportation. In general, large sculptures were transported by a kelek, a raft made up of inflated goat skins tied together and lashed to a platform of timber beams. Its name deriving from Akkadian, it has been in use for millennia and represented both in ancient and modern times. As their 4-day trip from Mosul to Baghdad could potentially be intercepted, Rawlinson's plan to send a steamer would make this process safer. However, that particular mission was a failure. Their ship was not powerful enough to navigate the rapids around Tikrit and had to return to Baghdad. Still, Captain Jones later participated in a number of archaeological surveys and, on Layard's request, produced highly accurate and highly ornate maps of Nineveh and Nimrud, entitled in cuneiform as the Land of Ashur, as you see the close-ups on this slide. Jones would later succeed Rawlinson as the interim political agent in Baghdad, so that, in Rawlinson's words, as far as antiquities are concerned, the change will make no difference. Reaching Baghdad on keleks, antiquities would be sent downstream to Basra. British rafts stranded on the way would be recovered by Captain Jones's steamer. When a suitable vessel was not available, as was the case with the French, whose consulate did not own a steamer, the cargo would be left in Baghdad for months. In fact, steamships were treated as priceless assets, giving governments an edge in their fierce competition for collecting. For instance, prior to the French shipwreck that I mentioned earlier, Rawlinson refused to allow the British steamer escort the French convoy. The next stop was Basra, where the British government had a depot at a place called Magil to store coal and to assemble the ships sent in parts from Europe. When the British proposed to dismantle the fleet and remove this depot, it was again Rawlinson who successfully intervened to keep it. Taking advantage of the 1867 law allowing foreigners to purchase property, this depot, along with extensive tracts of agricultural land in Basra, was acquired by the Lynch Company and became the destination for all antiquities excavated by the British and destined for Europe. The activities of the Lynch Company were soon to face intense competition from the Ottomans, who began commercial transportation in Iraq in the late 1860s. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 significantly reduced the distance to Europe and multiplied the export volume at Basra. Therefore, Mithat Pasha, governor in Baghdad, established a regular steamer service between Basra and Constantinople through the canal. From 1840s on, there were unsystematic Ottoman attempts to search for antiquities in the provinces, and navy steamers were the most convenient way to bring these to the capital. Later on, Ottoman shares from foreign excavations were kept and sometimes displayed in governmental buildings and high schools, and selected objects were then sent to Basra with one of the Tigris steamers to be further relayed to Constantinople. Like the British, Ottomans rarely let foreign teams use their ships and declined German requests to operate a steamer on the Tigris dedicated to their excavations at Asur. Interestingly, while the first Ottoman ships were generically named Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul, the largest of the new ships bore the names of ancient sites like Babil, Asur, or Nineveh. By the late 19th century, steamer schedules were reliable enough to be published in travel guides, and competition pulled the rates of freight down. However, sending a shipment from Basra to Baghdad remained as expensive as shipping the same cargo from Basra to London. Therefore, early excavations mainly utilized either the Navy ships over Bombay or sailing ships belonging to the Lynch Company. In order to illustrate more clearly how steamships were located at the heart of politics, commerce, and archaeology, I'd like to end with an elusive name that comes up frequently in seemingly unrelated contexts, a merchant by the name of Alexander Hector. As an officer in the British Navy, Hector participated in the early surveys for steam navigation in Iraq. Among his fellow travelers were Christian Rassam, who was employed as a translator back then, and the Lynch brothers. Then Hector left the Navy, settled in Baghdad as a merchant, and became the first trader to establish a steamer line between London and the Gulf. Around this time, he befriended Layard, for whom he carried out half diplomatic, half commercial missions and helped him construct specially designed keleks. As a trader, one of his agents was again Christian Rassam, now vice consul, who was involved in wool trade both personally and on commission for a variety of merchant houses, which unsurprisingly also included the Lynch Company, now Hector's main rival in business. In fact, Hector once formally complained that the British representative at Baghdad favored the Lynch brothers over him by letting them use the consulate steamer to transport goods without paying river duties. In 1844, having no other title than a merchant, Hector attended the consular trip that I mentioned with Rawlinson and Jones, and was referred to as Mr. H in the official report. During this trip, he not only aimed to establish trade relations in the region, but also searched for antiquities and copied ancient descriptions. Later, he went to Khorsabad, which had been excavated by the French, and took the liberty of removing the faces of numerous sculptures. This mutilation was not only due to aesthetic concerns, guided by the size standards of Western portraiture, but also to facilitate their easier transportation, as he participated in a larger system of gift exchange among the upper echelons of European society. For instance, he sent these 4 reliefs on the left as gifts to Christian Rassam, the vice consul at Mosul, who forwarded them to Stratford Canning, the British ambassador at Constantinople, who had supported the British campaigns from the beginning. Then Canning gifted them to these 2 powerful politicians of the time, shown on the right-hand side. Arriving in England in early 1846, these were the first Assyrian reliefs to reach Europe, months before the earliest official shipment. The rest of the sculptures collected by Hector were later sold to the British Museum, shifting the nature of Assyrian reliefs from gifts to commodities. In fact, Layard himself was heavily engaged in a similar policy of gift exchange, and among the recipients were members of the Lynch family as well, who received sculptures in return for their assistance in shipping. Hector returned to Britain in 1857 as a wealthy man, but maintained his trade relations in Baghdad. We read in the Ottoman sources that in 1874, he received the proceeds from the sale of an Ottoman steamer, Nineveh, in lieu of his dues accrued at the Baghdad treasury over the years. In 1884, Hector owned the only bank in Baghdad with an office in London, and at one point in his long career, he was involved in arms dealing in Iran as well. The many hats Hector wore reflects how intricate this network of politicians, diplomats, steamship employees, merchants, and dealers was. In fact, people like Hector, always moving under the radar, were even better connected than official diplomats, as they could easily put on their merchant hats to cut across national boundaries, like he did by digging at Khorsabad, a French site. Hector was only one of such individuals, both local and European, who established the material foundations for excavating, moving, and trading antiquities on a large scale. They employed hundreds of locals, who in turn kept this entire system alive. It suffices here to mention Cebrail Asfar, whose family ran steamer services between Basra and Europe, and who was so involved in antiquities trade that he could suggest the French vice consul to excavate Tello. Later on, Asfar's descendants would establish a famous antiquities firm based in Damascus and Beirut. Such individuals were only the tip of the iceberg, indicators of a vast supply network built around the introduction of steamers, without which colonial archaeology would be unthinkable. I intend to further explore the rest of the iceberg in my dissertation. Thank you. Now I'd like to hand it over to our next speaker, Zeynep.
Thank you. Today, I would like to thank both Professor Çelik and the Columbia Center in Istanbul for this opportunity. I'm going to talk about Ottomans and Iranians at Tisiphone. So in 1921, Mehmet Emin, later taking the surname Yordakul, a Turkish nationalist poet and politician who was stationed in Mosul during World War I, wrote on the first page of his book that you see on the slide on the triumphs of the Ottoman army in Iraq during the war, that the old ruined city of Madain, situated in the region of Salman Ipek, has been witness to two great events in the space of 1317 years. The first was the magnificent capital of Khosrow, with its many fortifications, which was conquered in 637 by Sa'd ibn Ibadah in the battle with Rustam. The throne of Khosrow was toppled because of this great holy war. The Iwan of Tisiphone, having previously been the place of manifestation of Zoroastrianism, was used in service of Muslim prayers upon the recitation of the conquest prayer. The second event, the Battle of Salman Ipek, occurred during the second year of the Great War in July 1915 in the ruins of this magnificent capital city, where no trace or monument was left but the Arch of Tisiphone, where the Ottoman Iraqi forces defeated the enemy. So here, Mehmet Emin connected 2 points in the history of the Arch of Tisiphone, situated in southern deserts of Baghdad, making a direct connection between Ottoman history and Islamic history, centering Tisiphone as the place of triumphs of Muslims against infidel powerful empires, the Sasanians and the British. What you see on the cover of the book is again a direct connection between the many histories of this place. It shows the Arch of Tisiphone on the right and the tomb of Salman Ipek on the left. Salman was the only Persian companion of the Prophet who is remembered as participating in the conquest by inviting the local population to Islam. He's a constant reminder of the Islamic history of this place, even if you do not know how the Arch of Tisiphone is remembered in Perso-Islamic historiography. In this presentation, I would like to talk about the meaning that the history of the Arch of Tisiphone evoked during the late 19th century, not between the Ottomans and the British, but between the Ottomans and the Qajars in Iran, who had a shared understanding of the history of this place through their shared heritage of Perso-Islamic history. I focus on this side because though immensely important for the engagement of the Ottomans, the Qajars, and the local Iraqi population with the past of the region, it did not garner as much attention from the Europeans. The first excavation of the site only occurred in 1928 by the Germans because it was not a biblical site. the main object of 19th century archaeology in Ottoman Iraq. By moving away from how Europeans told histories of the place, I demonstrate the old and new ways that the Ottomans and the Iranians engaged and contested ancient history and sites in service of their own imperial aims. Using the case of the Arch of Tisiphone, I highlight production of both textual and visual knowledge by Ottomans and Qajars, as well as the local population in service of claiming the past and present of Ottoman Iraq. So why is the Arch of Tisiphone important? Mehmet Emin already gave us an idea. It was the site of the last battle between the Sasanians and the Muslims, where the Sasanian Empire fell and the Muslims became triumphant over a vast, powerful state. But the Arch of Tisiphone looms much larger in Islamic history because it is deemed a site of miracle by Muhammad. In Perso-Islamic history, a shared heritage between the Ottomans and Iranians, the Great Arch of Tisiphone cracked on the occasion of the birth of the Prophet. So, as described in the fourth Baghdad Salnameh, pages of which you see here, published in 1883, the miracle is that the building did not collapse and has withstood for the past 1300 years despite the crack. The crack, which was supposedly visible even in 1883, was the harbinger of Muslim triumph achieved 8 years after its appearance. Sasanians are an ancient Persian or Iranian empire, but the Ottomans considered themselves an inheritor to this Perso-Islamic past. This is clearly demonstrated in the Baghdad Salnamehs, where you have both tables of important events and dynasties, as shown on the right, as well as narrative history, as shown on the left, that the putting Ottomans in clear continuous lines of kingship from actually all the ancient Iranian empires, even once before the Sasanians, to the Islamic dynasties of the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and finally the Seljuks. The Ottomans were emulating empires before them who incorporated Sasanian history and its sites in a particular way, to be both considered as inheritors of that heritage, but also triumphant over it. Baghdad Salnamehs are important sources to think about how the Ottoman provincial government engaged with the past of the province of Baghdad. The Baghdad Salnamehs, similar to all the provincial Salnamehs published in the Ottoman Empire since 1851, were compiled by the administrators at the provincial government from a variety of sources. This material was then organized into the template of provincial Salnamehs and finally published at the provincial government's printing house. The Salnamehs were not supposed to function as administrative documents. They were like encyclopedias of knowledge about the past and present of the province, disseminated through printed text far and wide. Anyone could buy a Salnameh that circulated within and outside the empire. So not only did the Salnamehs physically end up in different places, but the material in them would be republished. The narrative history presented in the fourth Baghdad Salnameh, published in 1883, which included the history of the Arch of Tisiphone, was republished in an Istanbul newspaper called Tariq only a year later in 1884. The circulation of this text did not end there, as the Tariq articles were then picked up by Muhammad Arif, known as Ispanakci, the Ottoman translator at the Iranian court, and translated into Persian. The Persian translation is available as manuscripts not only in the archives of the central court, but copies were made for and gifted to Mas'ud Mirza Zello Sultan, the provincial prince governor of Isfahan. So something produced in Baghdad ended up in 2 imperial centers and then another provincial center. So why did Muhammad Arif actually translate the Tariq articles, which were published in Istanbul? This is because the Iranian court was engaged in producing a geographical encyclopedia of Iranian lands that Baghdad and Tisiphone were conceived to be a part of. The geographical encyclopedia was called Mir'at al-Buldan, or Mirror of the Lands, which included entries on cities and important sites in alphabetical order. The history of the Arch of Tisiphone was told in a separate entry on Iwan, or Iwan-e-Kasra. Mir'at, similar to the Salnamehs, was also a compilation of knowledge from a variety of sources. In rare occasions, it also included maps and sketches, one of those being for the Arch of Tisiphone, which included both a map and a sketch, as you see. So both the map and the sketch were copies from the images accompanying the French Lejeune Travels in Babylon, published in Le Tour du Monde in 1867. The image of the arch was copied from a photograph. You see that in the process of copying from the Le Mans sketch, the Merat one, the arch became pointed, whereas it is round in actuality. What you also see on top of the sketch that appeared in Merat is a series of measurements of the arch, which were taken during the trip of the Iranian Shah, Nasser-ad-Din Shah, in 1870-1871 to Ottoman Iraq. This illustrates how the Qajars were clearly producing scientific knowledge about an ancient site. Nasser-ad-Din Shah not only traveled to Ottoman Iraq, but also wrote and published a travelogue on his trip. During his trip, he visited the Arch of Tisiphone twice, actually on the same steep ships that Erhan talked about, once almost getting lost in the process. He wrote a detailed description of his history in his travelogue, which was then republished in Merat. In this history, what the Qajars emphasized was who built the palace, which was Khosrow Anushiravan, the great Sasanian king, whose justice was to be emulated in the mirror for princess literature throughout the Islamic world. The focus on Khosrow was not accidental, or was not a matter of finding origins of a place. It was in direct service of Qajar claims over Ottoman Iraq. Nasser-ad-Din Shah, through his travel and travelogue, was making a direct connection between the Arch of Tisiphone and the Sasanian site at Tagh-Postan, which you see a photo of at the top right, where Khosrow was portrayed as engaged in the kingly act of hunting. So these are two photos from Tagh-Postan with Khosrow hunting in the middle. Nasser-ad-Din Shah was also an avid hunter, writing in his travelogue that once he shot a bird in Ottoman Iraq so skillfully that the Ottomans themselves were in awe. Through hunting, he was asserting his mastery over the wild in the land, something easily extendable to the land itself. The Ottoman awe was also a sign of their recognition of this. So Nasser-ad-Din Shah, performatively, through his travel and textually through his travelogue, connected the two sides of the Arch of Tisiphone and Tagh-Postan to assert his claims on both sides of the border, on the two Iraqs, Iraq Arab, which was Ottoman Iraq, and Iraq Ajam, which was the central Iranian heartlands. In telling the history and making direct connections between himself and Qajar kingship with Khosrow Anushiravan and the Sasanians, Nasser-ad-Din Shah was claiming the same Perso-Islamic past as the Ottomans. He was just emphasizing the glories of it to further justify his claims and disregard the Ottoman ones, who were claiming the Muslim triumph over the civilization it represented. If you remember, Mehmed Amin mentioned Khosrow, but only in the context of triumph of Muslim armies against his magnificent capital city. Nasser-ad-Din Shah was part of the larger group of the many Qajar statesmen who traveled to Ottoman Iraq to not only perform pilgrimage to the shrines in Najaf and Karbala, but pay homage to the ancient site of the Arch of Tisiphone. Another way Nasser-ad-Din Shah performed his mastery over the land was through photography. So all the photos you've seen in the past 3 slides are taken from his trip. He had his court photographer with him with a makeshift studio in a carriage who captured the likeness of these ancient sites. Photos were then printed and circulated not only at the court, but among the Qajar elite. The photos created a visual literacy around ancient sites. The Qajars, however, were not the only ones taking photos of Tisiphone. I will discuss 2 examples of this to show the extent to which the Arch of Tisiphone was recorded, its history retold and molded as part of larger narratives and claims to space. So first is this photo and painting by Alexander Svoboda, which ended up in British India sometime between 1858 and 1866. The photo was considered as one of the first photographs of the Arch of Tisiphone available in Western Europe. Alexander Svoboda, the 2 photos of which you see here, was born in Baghdad in 1828, but moved to Izmir in 1858 to establish a photographic studio. His father, Anton Svoboda, was born in 1796 in Osijek in modern-day Croatia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he then traveled to Baghdad, working there as a glass merchant. Alexander's mother, Euphemie, was from a prominent Chaldean Catholic Armenian merchant family in Istanbul. Alexander lived in India and Bombay as a young man, where he also sold and advertised his paintings and photographers. His brother was actually one of the main people working for the Lynch steamships and stayed in Baghdad. So that is how his photograph of Tisiphone and painting, which is most likely based on the photo, reached British India. And later, it appeared as lithography sketches in not only the French illustrated journal Le Magazine Pittoresque in 1876, a copy of which you see on the right, on the bottom right, but also in Asar Ajam, or monuments of, or Iranian monuments on the bottom left, which in 1896 by Forsat Shirazi, which is arguably the first comprehensive Persian study of ancient Iranian sites. So moving on from Alexander Svoboda, you can see there are two other photos that I want to discuss, photographed by A. Karim, published in Baghdad around 1923 in a book called Camera Studies in Iraq. There is not much available on Karim's life. The two photos of the arch that you see are from two different times. The image on the left, which shows the right side of the building intact, was definitely taken before the flood in 1888. The second on the right is an aerial photo taken after First World War. Karim's photos taken in 1920s from the British officials in Baghdad also appear in British archives, such as Gertrude Bell's archive. More interestingly for our story, his photos also appeared, this specific photo, which is depicting a Bedouin local Iraqi, also appeared in Servet al-Funun, but it was captioned as a dervish. I very much doubt that the captions of the photos in the albums were written by A. Karim himself, as the same man appears in another photo in the same album, identified as a mullah. Servet al-Funun was the most popular Ottoman illustrated journal published in Istanbul. Karim's photos appeared in a series of articles published in 1897 by Mehmet Tevfik after he became the editor of the journal in 1896. These articles and the photos appeared in 21 issues of Servet al-Funun. Mehmet Tevfik, however, did not include any photos of the Arch of Tisiphone. According to my research, most journals published in Istanbul did not feature the Arch of Tisiphone. They actually rarely discussed Iraq. The only other illustrated journal which actually did so was Shehbal, featuring photos from different sources in issues after the publication of two articles called Letters from Iraq, or Iraq Mektupları, by Bedi Nuri in 1913. The photo of the arch, which you see here, was probably a copy from one of the photos taken by the Underwood and Underwood photographers as a stereograph similar to that, to the Shehbal photo, is available in the Library of Congress. The photo was then more readily available to purchase either in Beirut, where Bedi Nuri lived, or in Istanbul, where Shehbal was published, as Underwood and Underwood had a global circulation of his stereographs. Angle of the photo is similar to the sketch which appeared on the Mehmet Emin's piece on the Battle of Salman Pak. What the photographs show us is the extent to which visual literacy of the Arch of Tisiphone existed in the Ottoman center and province. It seems that the provincial elite, through the Baghdad Salname and the local photographers such as Karim and Alexander Svoboda, were more readily engaged in producing both textual and visual knowledge about the history of the province of Baghdad. The imperial center at Istanbul was merely a consumer, only producing knowledge on the province once they had lost the province during First World War, and soon forgetting about it altogether. The Iranians, in contrast, were actively engaged throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in producing textual and visual knowledge about the Arch of Tisiphone and incorporating it in their claims to the past and present of Ottoman Iraq. Tisiphone loomed so large in Iranian imagination that after the fall of the Qajars, the Pahlavis built the National Museum of Iran in its image. Their contestation was now with the nation state of Iraq. Now I'll give it to Dotan. Thank you.
Unmute yourself, Dotan.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Zeynep. Thank you, Professor Çelik, for the invitation and for doing this paper for quite a long time now. And thanks to the Istanbul Columbia Center for organizing this event. In May 1922, a junior inspector of antiquities in the Palestine Department of Antiquities under the British mandate was sent to conduct an archaeological survey in the city of Gaza. Following his visit, he embarked upon a series of articles documenting the several dozens of Arabic inscriptions that he found in the city. The inspector, Leo A. Meyer, would soon gain fame as a prominent Orientalist and join the faculty of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His series of Gaza articles is considered to this day a milestone in the study of Palestine under Islamic rule. But as a young antiquities inspector, Meyer's quest for Arabic inscriptions also had a rather instrumental function. In his survey report, Meyer concluded that 18 of the inscriptions are historical, yet the others are of the date later than 1700. By identifying the inscribed dates, Meyer sorted the historic buildings in Gaza to those older than the year 1700 and those younger. Now, that was not Meyer's personal preference. In specifying these dates, Meyer had followed the definition of the Mandatory Antiquities Ordinance that took antiquities to be any object of construction made by human agency earlier than 1700. Such antiquities, historic buildings in this case, were protected by the new law against modification or destruction. In his visit to Gaza then, Meyer had to spot these older than 1700 buildings and have the department register them as protected monuments. The mandatory clear-cut definition of antiquities according to a chronological threshold was novel. Neither the British law regarding historical monuments nor the former Ottoman antiquities laws going back to 1869 defined antiquities according to their period. In both, any artifact from the past could have been considered a protected antiquity. But the mandatory law did that, and not only in Palestine, but in all the former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, including Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and Iraq. In my short presentation today, I wish to touch upon three aspects of what I would like to term the 1700 antiquities threshold. First, I would try to point to where this definition came from. Second, I will turn back to Gaza and point briefly to some of the consequences of this law. And finally, I would try to examine the British definition for antiquities upon the backdrop of the former Ottoman policy. So let us start with the origin. The new definition for antiquities in the Mandate territories was suggested during the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. It was a part of a much broader effort to internationalize the post-war administration of antiquities and archaeological work in the Near East and Asia Minor. The Ottoman Empire had lost its sovereignty over these lands, and the Allied powers now opted to establish an open-door policy between European powers to allow mutual access to archaeological sites, and most importantly, to regulate the division of artifacts between the local museums and the visiting expeditions. These policies were framed as reversing the former Ottoman laws, which made obtaining licenses for archaeological work complicated and exporting antiquities illegal. Under the British and French control, each of the League of Nations A mandates, that is, those in the former Ottoman territories, were obliged to enact a new law of antiquities in line with the new international guidelines. Among other things, these new guidelines redefined antiquities as older than 1700. Clearly, ruling out of the law anything from 1700 onwards attests to a bias toward the late Ottoman heritage. An interesting precedent in this regard is the antiquities law the British enacted in Cyprus in 1905. This enactment replaced the former Ottoman law and redefined antiquities as objects from the most ancient times to the Turkish conquest of the island. George Jeffrey, the British director of the Cyprus Museum, roughly around the same time, wrote that the Turkish mosques are particularly without artistic character, and that Ottoman attempts at carved decorations and architectural details are of the poorest and most inartistic kind possible, end quote. This line of thinking was in accord with the widespread Western art historical discourse, within which post-medieval Islamic art and architecture was derivative and even degenerate. Notable in this regard is Bannister Fletcher's 1901 categorization of Western and non-Western architectural styles as historic and non-historic. The latter, quote, can scarcely be interesting from an architect's point of view as those of Europe, unquote. Yet not often the British put their disinterest in Ottoman remains in so many words. Disregarding the Ottoman heritage seemed to have been just a natural thing to do. For an example, after World War I, even before the mandates were established, British military governors in the occupied Ottoman territories, no archaeology specialists by any means, saw a need to protect antiquities by proclaiming provisional antiquities ordinances. They defined them as antecedent to the year 1600 in the case of Palestine and 1500 in Mesopotamia. No justification was given to these specific dates, and none was given either when the civil ordinance later set the threshold on 1700. As I would now turn to argue, the specific year was not that important. 1500, 1600, or 1700, these were merely markers for the crucial yet undeclared assumption that there are periods that lay outside historical significance. To show this, let us now examine how the British Antiquities Ordinance worked in practice. The British, after all, could not just ignore structures built after 1700. Once encountering monumental buildings from these periods, then, the British had to manipulate the land's history in order to include them within the law. For an example, let us return to Gaza. In his report, Meyer had mentioned the distinguishable ruin of a caravanserai named Khanezet in the center of Gaza. It having no inscription or other indicative signs to rely on, Meyer could not date the structure. It was also hard to fully understand the structural logic of Khanezet, since it had been disfigured during World War I when the Ottoman governor of Syria, Jemal Pasha, paved a boulevard right through it, as you can see here where my marker is. In 1934, more than a decade after Meyer's visit to Gaza, a former shopkeeper in the Khan appealed to the municipality of Gaza to permit the rebuilding of his shop. Per routine procedure, his request was forwarded to the Department of Antiquities. The Khan was never defined as a historical monument, yet the department sent its inspector, Hilary Waddington, to the spot anyway. Waddington, who was also an architect, fell in love with the scenic ruin and decided that it must be preserved. As mentioned, there was nothing to testify to the age of the building, yet Meyer's article series did mention an inscription right nearby in the old Caesarea market of Gaza. Here it is, the inscription. The inscription told that the market was built by a Mamluk Sultan, the name of Nasser ibn al-Kalaun, as an annex to the Gaza Friday Mosque. Examining the Khan's architecture, Waddington decided that the mosque here, the market here, and the Khan itself are all of the same conception. The quote may be assumed to have been finished before 1350 AD. In other words, Waddington made the Khan a Mamluk structure and thus a site undoubtedly protected by the Antiquities Ordinance. The shopkeeper's request for reconstruction was virtually denied. The department ruled that the Khan must be preserved rather than merely reconstructed. To this end, the department had to apply for funds, find a specialist in Mamluk architecture, conceive a preservation plan, and hire workers. This process alone stretched for over 13 years and was never completed. In the meantime, the department prevented anyone from approaching the compound. Precluded from recovery, the ruin became an occasional garbage dump. Gazans soon understood that once the British marked a building as an antiquity, it turned into a no man's land. In requesting permits for other buildings, Gazans made sure to state explicitly that the structure in question were new or contained no historical remains. They too understood, at least outwardly, that post-1700 means non-historic. One important impediment that the British encountered in Khanezade was that the building apparently belonged to the Al-Ridwan family Waqf. It was a religious trust, and its administrators did not have the means to support preservation the way the British wanted. If the British would have been a little more careful then, they would have understood that this fact alone ties the Khan to the prominent dynasty of Ottoman governors in Greater Syria of the Ridwan family. This makes the Khan an Ottoman structure par excellence, and of course not a Mamluk one. Moreover, as the heydays of the Ridwanis stretched between the 16th and 17th centuries, the Khan could have been protected by the Antiquities Ordinance even as an Ottoman structure. But the exact year of the threshold was hardly the point. The British wanted the Khan to belong to what was considered a more glorious phase of Islamic architecture, hence they made it Mamluk. Only as such, it could have been charged with historical value, hence meriting preservation. Now we may ask, why does it matter? The British finally wanted to preserve the building due to its monumental qualities. Now that is true. Yet to do so, the antiquities threshold compelled them to erase this building's identity as an Ottoman structure, and by extension to deny the centuries of Ottoman rule as having a unique heritage. In doing so, moreover, the British urge to preserve an alleged antiquity from a distant past only resulted in further ruination, preventing local schemes for reconstruction. Gaza is only one example. The rule of the renowned 18th century Ottoman governors Dair el-Omar and Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar, for example, left many monumental buildings in the Galilee region of Palestine, most prominently the citadel and walls of Acre, Haifa, Tiberias, and the forts of countryside towns like Shefa Amer and Dir Hana. The British found many of these worthy of preservation, but to do so, they had to perform legal and ideological acrobatics that camouflaged the identity of the buildings. In Tiberias, for example, the monuments were categorized as medieval. In Acre, the walls had been related to the entire city, which dated back to the time of the Crusaders. But while we're judging the British so harshly, and as we approach the conclusion, we must be fair and ask whether the Ottoman approach was any different. We do know that monuments of the recent centuries were not high on the Ottoman agenda of antiquities preservation as well. The Ottoman Imperial Museum mainly celebrated artifacts from the ancient Near Eastern civilizations and the Greco-Roman classical periods in accordance with European taste. The Ottoman case, however, I wish to argue, was different, because within the empire, Islamic artifacts and monuments were considered inseparable from the contemporary Islamic civilization and not emblems of historical past. This ambiguous treatment of Islamic artifacts and monuments also had to do with the fact that many of these, even if very old, were taken to be still in some sort of use and often under the custody of the Evkaf. This fact contained a dissonance. While antiquities laws were meant to prevent changes in monuments' original design, Evkaf regulations were meant for upkeeping the utility and profitability of structures, which often naturally entailed structural changes. Islamic monuments, thus, represent a different register of historicity, that of a living heritage of the contemporary civilization, where assets endowed for eternity still had a function in real life, unlike historical heritage, which remained frozen in time. There was no need then for the Ottoman law to frame out periods in history, since the heritage of the state transitioned smoothly from ancient times to the contemporary culture with no threshold to mark this passage. Moreover, having no chronological marker, the Ottoman law allowed the Imperial Museum to cope with changes in taste. During his tenure as the director of the Imperial Museum, starting 1910, Khalil Ethembe, paid increasing effort to protect and preserve Islamic and Ottoman monuments, including that of recent centuries. This effort resulted in enacting his comprehensive Muhafazai Abidat Nizamnamesi in 1912. Khalil tried to lead a change in the conception of Ottoman heritage, maybe toward a hybrid approach combining antiquities preservation with Evkaf maintenance. Such an approach might have dealt better with the case of Khanezade of Gaza, an Ottoman structure, a Waqf asset, and an antiquity all at once. The Ottoman Empire headed in this direction, but the mandatory laws nipped this development in the bud, separating Ottoman from monumental and historic from contemporary. I wish to pass on the microphone for our discussant, Professor Diane Favro.
Thank you, Dotan. Before we move on to the discussion, I would like to remind our audience that we will have a Q&A session in the end. So please feel free to post your questions. And now we will move on to the discussion. So let me leave the word to Professor Favro. Thank you.
Do I need to do anything for the screen, or is this fine? Can you hear me?
This looks great. Yes,
Fine?
yes, this looks good.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, yes.
Thank you for 3 very stimulating papers, which really opened up my eyes, and I'm sure the eyes and ears of the audience, to a whole range of important issues today, but also seeing them from different viewpoints. I'm really struck overall with the connectivity and timeliness of all of these issues today, as Zeynep had outlined at the beginning of this talk. In particular, just to say a couple words in general, this focus on objects, which in all 3 papers, the architecture is looked at as a thing, and the people of its original time don't appear very often. So we're talking about objects, not architects or occupants, very much in terms of the history of the past. Another thing, of course, from my own viewpoint as a classical scholar, is how the region's own classical heritage doesn't appear very important. Now, I'll start with and go through each paper. Maybe we'll have the person answer after each question. So to start with Erhan, I really enjoyed seeing your viewpoint, which again changes from looking at an object, but looking at the connections along the river. I'd particularly like to have you say a little bit more about the use of these rivers as barriers. They had this rich heritage with the consuls. And what I like about your paper in particular is that it creates a network of connections that's distinctly different from the ones that we usually get in books, which focus on an individual object and compare that object to other typologies. Here you're linking them topographically with a river. So I'd like you to talk about situating this kinetic connection and discuss whether you thought it was more of a barrier or to the movement of goods and peoples within Mesopotamia, or if you really think it was a connector.
Certainly. Within Mesopotamia, rivers were, I think, more of a connector than a barrier. And this is valid also for ancient times, because it was always cheaper and faster to transport goods and people by water than by land. However, for inter-regional travel, let's say to Anatolia or to the Mediterranean coast, they were regarded as obstacles. I mean, obstacles to be overcome, obstacles to be boasted about, so to say. A number of Assyrian kings boasted about how they managed to cross the Euphrates, or how many times they managed to cross the Euphrates on their way to the Mediterranean. In modern times, the introduction of steamers actually revealed a very specific kind of obstacle as well. For example, the Euphrates was not really navigable for steamships due to all kinds of debris, rocks, structures like water wheels in the riverbed and decreasing its depth. The same went for the northern parts of the Tigris as well, especially between Mosul and Baghdad. And as I mentioned, all of the Assyrian sites are located in that specific section. And that's why Henry Rawlinson wanted to send a steamer upstream to help layer it out. And that's why he failed. Still, the southern section between Baghdad and Basra and steam navigation there was so significant that it really facilitated all the changes I mentioned in my talk. So also in modern times, then rivers were more of a connector than a barrier, I would say.
And do you think that even larger pieces could be taken of antiquities because of the size of the steamers?
Yes, for the later part of the century, yes. The first ships in the 1840s were smaller vessels, which were more suitable to escort those rafts that I talked about, the keleks. Mm-hmm. So keleks did the heavy lifting of these huge sculptures. But in the 1870s, especially the 80s, ships got larger, even the river ships got larger, so they were able to carry them down to Basra. But I would like to note that keleks, the rafts, they are still used, and they are still effective, and it is probably still the fastest way to reach Basra from Baghdad.
And I also was interested in these steamers as social spaces, who was on the steamers. And you mentioned, of course, the consuls, but there was a whole range of people there.
Yes, definitely. So the diplomats, archaeologists, their families, also merchants. I mean, merchants were probably the most frequent customers, pilgrims, and soldiers. There were definitely social spaces in that sense, because as you saw the schedules, a single trip would take days, at least, almost a week from Basra to Baghdad upstream. So definitely they were used to conduct business, do some networking perhaps. And in one of the photographs that I have shown, it was clear that some people were selling things there as well. So it was also some sort of a small-scale market space for them. Yeah, definitely social spaces, I would say, but there are really bits and pieces of information on that in diaries or memoirs, so we don't really have much on it.
And how often did these have a sink or have a disaster and have those been excavated, those sunken versions, and so we could see their whole cargo?
No, I don't know of any such excavations, but there were many accidents, that's for sure. And they were attacked as well. That's why they are armed, as I mentioned in my talk. They were frequently attacked. And most of the times, it was a way for the local population to get the attention of the authorities because they had some sort of a land-related problem. For example, I think it was in Gökhan Çetinsayar's book, there's a section on tribal problems. And when you look at those individual problems, they all begin with an initial attack on a steamer. And then you see that it has much deeper roots that they wanted to highlight with that attack. So yes, they were attacked, but I don't think that we have any excavations of steamers. No.
Well, I'm interested because there's always these excavations of ancient ships, which are very informative. And you started out mentioning one that sunk. Yeah, I can ask many questions. I'm kind of unsure of my time here. Zeynep? Zeynep, are you there?
I think we should move to the next one because we do want to reserve some time for the question and answer period.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Open. Thank you. We'll stay in touch. Okay, next was Zeynep. Of course, Ctesiphon is one of my favorite sites, and in particular because when I was first a student with Zeynep years ago, I was so fascinated with it, and I couldn't find anything about it in the Western press. So your talk really opened up a lot of questions and provided a tremendous amount of information about it. And I particularly like that you're looking at the politics of modernity and archaeology between two non-Western, as we say, I hate that word, as two other empires. And so I'd like if you could maybe expand on that and open up a little more about, you identified valuation of the different structures, but maybe more open that up a little bit more. In particular, I'm interested, as you may know or guess, in the structure being called an arch or a vault. Was the valuation seems to me to have been primarily in regards to history or an event rather than in terms of the architectural form.
Thank you for your comments and questions. So thinking about sort of why I specifically talk about sort of the Ottomans and Iranians is because we take how Europeans dealt with the past as the main yardstick of how we should deal with the past, and also ancient sites. And it's also very ingrained in nationalist discourses that it's seen as the sort of the most normal and natural way of thinking and talking about sort of ancient sites. And this is what the sort of the Ottomans and the Qajars were dealing with at the time as well, because this was a very hegemonic discourse of sort of how to think about ancient history or write about it. So as much as all the stuff that I discussed sort of were heavily rooted in how the Ottomans and the Qajars understood their own history and past, the sort of the Perso-Islamic past, they were very much contending with this sort of European hegemonic discourse. And in terms of sort of it being called an Iwan or an arch, for most of most of both the Ottoman actually and Persian sources, they do refer to it as an Iwan. It was recognized that this was sort of the entrance to a palace structure, and only sort of the facade and the arch sort of were visible, at least in sort of in 19th century. But I think, but they do talk about sort of how magnificent the arch is, because it's huge. It's really monumental. And if you go to the site, it sits in sort of literally middle of the desert, and you have this huge arch, which looks like really out of this world. And it's flat, and you have the river kind of going by the side of it. And there isn't much sort of the ancient city left there, or what, the building sort of, apart from Salman Pak's shrine, which is there. And then the British actually took another shrine there. They transferred another shrine next to Salman's shrine later in 20th century. There is a tiny town village there, but there isn't much else. So it really stands out, and is very monumental, literally. And actually, one of the things I realized in Erhan's slides was that it is one of the steamship stops. It appears as Taha Kasra, which means the Arch of Tisiphon. So it appears there as well, it was one of the places they stopped because there was a bridge there. So I hope I answered your questions.
Yes, I think I was also, you did subsequent valuation as a work of architecture. And because it didn't have that portability until photography and paintings circulated, it really was very little replicated outside of the example you gave. And it, of course, the scale makes it something challenging to replicate, even on a small scale, to do that particular kind of construction. And I thought the dissemination of the photographs with the similar angle, always trying to show both the whole facade and the vaulting, was particularly interesting. Nobody shows the back side.
There are actually photos of the back. I didn't include them. There is a photo of the back.
Oh, I've never seen one. I'd love to see that.
I'll send them to you. There's a photo of the back by the Qajars when they go there. They take a photo of the back. But I think one of the interesting things was Karim's photo, which is from the side. So you see some the remnants of the art. That one is the sort of the most abnormal one I've seen in all the photos that I've looked at.
Wonderful. I think that maybe we should move on to paper.
Thank you so much.
Dotan. Again, to talk about this architectural reception, a very timely issue now when people are trying to decide what do you preserve, what should you preserve. And one thing I was thinking about in regards to all of the papers was the portability, how these ideas circulate, whether it's by the river, whether it's through photographs and so forth. In American architectural history, there's a portability of certain timber structures so that historic buildings get moved and put into what a colleague of ours called architectural petting zoos, where they relocate buildings and put them all together in a new spot to preserve them historically, but detach them from their original context. Take them from different places and bring all Victorian buildings together, for example. And so this raised to me this question about this British treatment of the non-monumental buildings, such as the Han, and what you were discussing, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this particular interest in non-monumental, which you've discussed, but how do you preserve that if you don't integrate it into the life of the city, as you were saying at the end?
Yeah. Thanks so much for this question. I think it really touches to the heart of the matter of what the transition from the Ottoman antiquities to the mandates actually meant. I mean, one might say that this process was actually a kind of a demonumentalization, if there is such word, of the dealing with antiquities in the Middle East, whereas during the late Ottoman period, dealing with antiquities concentrated around specific sites or specific monuments. I mean, major archaeological sites, but and structures which gained fame in Europe. With the transition to the mandatory law, and this is where the chronological definition of the ordinance is becoming important, there was an infinite number of sites that were potentially protected antiquities. This is the meaning of the 1700 threshold, because if it falls under, which is older, it just had to find its way into the work of the Department of Antiquities in order to be an antiquity. So in fact, when one browses through the archives of the Palestine Department of Antiquities, one finds that I would say it's something like 80% of the documentation regards the surveying, protection, preservation of built landscape ruins that are ordinary or non-monumental, such as the Han. I mean, every municipal planning or building or demolition had to go through the Department of Antiquities and to be affirmed there. And if it was discovered as something of unique, so it could have found it, its historical origins would have been founded like in the case of the Han, or if it was indeed older than 1700, so it was protected. And this creates a massive logistics of surveillance and control, which fell under the authority of the Department of Antiquities. And sometime you would have get the case like this in Gaza, where it was not only the Han, but basically the entire city that the British department wanted to Mamlukize, or something of this sort, a kind of a small, something that is modeled upon the Cairo Comité work. And Gaza was a specific case within Palestine because it was a ruined city after World War I. Within the work of recovering the city, the Department of Antiquities found a fertile ground for a lot of things to put their hands on, because there were a lot of places that had to be reconstructed. So the department found its way right to put their hands in the middle of the process of reconstruction, and then to redesign the city as and revive its Mamluk heritage.
And were there legal trials, and was there a punishment if somebody didn't maintain the building? Were there legal repercussions?
Definitely, all the time. The Department of Antiquities worked very closely with the police and the courts, and in fact, even within this case of the Han, were several trial cases of people just building back their shops, even for just reconstructing a vault. People would have get tried, and the vault would have been destruct or ruined by the public works department, and of course for anything that could have been considered as willful destruction of antiquities, which included a lot of things. Even if people just thought that they are just rebuilding a wall within their house, but their house was apparently older than 18th century, it could have got into court.
Yes. And did that result in people having to move or leave their properties or sell?
Sometimes it did. For the most part, it created a new idea of what archaeology meant for the public. I think the most important thing is to think about the Department of Antiquities in the mandate territories as taking an important part within colonial form of control. And actually, that was its main, the lion's share of its work was to control population and landscape. Oftentimes people did lose their assets if it was, in many cases, hammams, which were the British were really wanted specific. I don't know why, but the specific genre of structures, and others as well. While anything that related to religious use were exempt. So sacred sites, tombs, mosques, obviously. But in a lot of other cases, indeed, the department could could have just taken buildings in order to reconstruct them and put them to a different use from what it was originally.
Thank you. Maybe we can now open up to the general questions.
Thank you. We have a few questions and more coming. So maybe I can start with first question, which is for Zeynep. This is a question by Sarah Irving. She thanks for the fascinating paper. So the question is, I was wondering about whether in written rather than visual material, the Ark of Ctesiphon appears in the works of the late 19th, early 20th century Qajar intellectuals who were constructing ideas of modern Iranian nationalism, Akhundzadeh, Kermani, etc. Is the lack of images in Ottoman Turkish publications down to the politics of competition with Iran?
Thank you, Marva and Sarah. So in terms of whether it appears in textual stuff, yes, definitely. I don't know specifically about Akhundzadeh or Kermani actually, but it appears, so for Sata Shirazi's book that I mentioned, Asar Ajam, where you saw sort of a plate that he produces, that's actually a sort of a compendium of knowledge, and it's written, like most of it is actually written stuff that he wrote about sort of ancient history of Iran, and he did archaeological stuff. He actually sort of went and translated the writings. He learned cuneiform and translated the writings into Persian himself. He didn't translate it from sort of European languages. But he was Shirazi. He was much more interested in what was happening in Fars. So he did Persepolis and sort of other sites in much more detail. But he literally went to Baghdad and went to sort of the sites in Ottoman Iraq and saw them and wrote about them as well. You have also a lot of Qajar educational texts, historical educational texts, like the most famous one, like Name Khosravan. They all talk about Tisiphon, and all of them include the poem by Khaqani, sort of I think 9th or 10th century poet, who talks about sort of this, like talks about the monumentality of the place, and that you should actually see it as a sign of, it should be a sign that you would learn from it. It was written for kings, so they would learn that, like, it doesn't matter how big the monuments you build, if you're not just, your empire is gonna fall. Which you have sort of similar Arabic poems about the site as well. So they were definitely writing about it. It wasn't just a visual knowledge that was what's being produced. Mer'at itself, Mer'at al-Buldan, which I talked about, has a huge entry on Tisiphon. And as I said, Nasser-Din Shah in his travelogue, which only had the written stuff, was also like wrote a lot about Tisiphon and the arch. In terms of why the Ottomans were not including images of the site, the Ottomans were dealing with a lot of competition in their lands in terms of sort of antiquities. And the site that in sort of Iraq, I think they were most in competition with both the Europeans and the Iranians, was actually Babylon. It was being excavated, but the Iranians also had a claim over that space through the connection they made with Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenids, that they didn't call Achaemenids at this time. They considered them as Kianian, which are part of sort of we consider them now mythical like Persian dynasties, which appear in Shahnameh and other sort of sources in Persian. So they were much more interested, like if they were doing visual stuff, they were basically much more interested in photos of the excavations which were happening in Babylon. The thing is, like, nobody excavated Tisiphon until after First World War. So it was just a huge site which was sitting there and everybody could see it. and everybody knew about it. So it has a very different sort of, you didn't need to unearth it. It was there, everybody could see it. So if you went to Iraq, you would see it. There was like no way. If you went from Baghdad to Basra, you'll see the site. So it had a very different sort of place visually and in people's imagination than all these places that had to be excavated.
Thank you. Another question from Sarah, this time for Dotan. Do you think the British treatment of antiquities in Gaza was to any extent influenced by the fact that the city is less closely bound up with biblical, especially New Testament, history than the central and northern zones of Mandate Palestine?
Thank you, Sarah. This is a fascinating question, and Erhan and Zeynep were discussing here the places which are passed by steamers and places which are not. So Gaza was a specific place where, when steamers started circulating in the Mediterranean, Gaza actually lost its place along the route that runs from Cairo to Greater Syria, because now steamers would dock in either in front of Jaffa or in Beirut, and Gaza was not a place for steamers to anchor. And that is how the late 19th century Grand Tour maps left Gaza out of its routes. And I think that might be a reason that you won't find much about Gaza in travelogues from last quarter of the 19th century. And this also might have led to the disinterest of, let's say, traditional archaeology around biblical sites. And there are biblical sites, of course, and as you mentioned, more indeed within the Old Testament. And of course, the sites relating to the Philistines in Philistia, and last to the New Testament. But indeed, there's a scarcity of excavations, especially in the late Ottoman period. But we should nevertheless mention one site or one series of excavations that were done by Flinders Petrie, and also, I mean, findings were later published very famously, but indeed also at this case, which were not biblical but pre-biblical, but also in this case, interestingly, what Petrie was trying to do is trace the expansion of the pharaohs to Greater Syria and to show their northern limit. And this also had to do with his own specific biography and politics vis-a-vis archaeology authorities with the British Mandate and in Cairo, which, if I'm not mistaken, banned him from continuing his expeditions in Cairo. But I guess that Sarah would know more about this. But otherwise, in accordance to my previous reply, I would have said that this is not only in Gaza, but basically during the Mandate period, most of the work that you would find that the department is doing is basically handling such cases like the one in Gaza, which were not within the major archaeological sites of the country. But I thank you very much for this idea, and I do need to think about it more. How Gaza is outside this biblical geography.
So, Dotan, we have another question for you from Orçuncan Okan. Did you come across instances when British measures regarding artifacts from the Ottoman era met with resistance or at least pushback from Gazans on the basis of the artifact's historical, cultural, or non-material value as Ottoman artifacts?
Yeah, thank you, Orçun. This is an interesting question. So, as I mean, whoever deals with the Arab territories post World War I knows that there's not a positive treatment of the Ottoman past, mainly due to national sentiments rising after World War I, and that was also very much the case in Gaza, and especially because it was a front, and oftentimes Ottoman soldiers are after the fact blamed for ruining the city during the war, and that was the case in Gaza as well, which had flourishing of Arab national societies during the Mandate period. Nevertheless, what you do find is the argument within Gaza that some places are not for historical, should not be historically preserved because these are still functioning and living buildings within the city. And this claim is being made upon their relation to the Ottoman past, sometimes as part of the FKAF, of the Ottoman Waqf administration that had been inherited by the Supreme Muslim Council after the British takeover, and other times, but just arguing against the British that such places cannot be interpreted as having some distant historical value going back to 18th century because people had been inhabiting them and living in them for all these last centuries. So the argument is more about whether these places, what the historicity of these places mean, and less about whether they represent specific Ottoman heritage or just local heritage of the place.
Thank you. Now we have a question for Zeynep by Sebastian Billard. So the question is, if I understood correctly, you said that the magazine Shehbay showed the arc of Tisiphon in approximately 1913. Do you consider the reference to Tisiphon in connection to appeals to protect antique sites similar to the ones Halil Ethem published about several Islamic sites and objects in his series of articles entitled Asari Atika, or was there another intention to publish the photograph?
Thank you for this question. I'm not familiar with the series of articles, but the way photos were published in these in Istanbul illustrated magazines was that they would basically for a lot of stuff, especially for the Iraq ones that I've looked at, is that they're collecting photos that are being taken. And as for example, the case with Karim showed, they were and Servet Funun, they were collecting from photos from that were being basically published by taken and published by the local photographers, and then sending them to Istanbul and publishing it. So some of it had to do with sort of what was happening. The photo which appeared in Shehbal was not taken by a local photographer. Obviously, it was taken by an Underwood photographer. So it's about sort of what they had access to in Istanbul to sort of publish. If you look at the other stuff that they published in the about Iraq, the photos, in the Shehbal articles, it's very random. It includes like the shrines, it includes the river, it includes the Ottoman governmental buildings, which were sort of by the river. All the consulates were on the river. Like one of the things that photographers did, local and sort of foreign in Iraq, they would just go on a sort of steamship or on a kelek and literally just take photos of sort of all of these sites which were by the river, by Tigris. So that's what they were doing. The other thing I would want to mention is that this was a site which was protected by God, literally. So it wasn't supposed to fall, and it didn't fall even after a flood took half of its facade. So I'm not sure how much the Ottomans thought about protecting the site because it was so well preserved and protected by God himself, even after floods, multiple floods, and even like if parts of it were taken. But I don't know. I have to look at those series of articles. Thank you for pointing them out.
Thank you, Zeynep. Now we have another question for Dotan from Ari Amaya Ackerman. So wondering here if these complex but very ambiguous definitions of antiquities and non-monumental, monumental has shaped modern archaeological authorities in countries in the region like Turkey or Israel, even Greece. Recently in his work, Dan Hicks wrote about the Colonial Museum as a tool for controlling time. So this really recalls for me a lot of things going on today in heritage politics in these countries.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very interesting question. A very interesting question in the case of, I mean, the main case I can talk about is Israel, and I know that Israel and Greece are very similar in this regard, taking archaeology to be foundational for national identity, of course. I can say that for the Israeli Antiquities Authority, that basically inherited the British one in full. I mean, its entire archive and structure and museum, and many of the founders of Israel's Antiquities Authority were actually practicing within the British one. They did so Israel first inherited the law and maintained the threshold that exists until this day in Israel, so the 1700 threshold. It enabled a lot of things in Israel. Inter alia was to destroy and eliminate the Palestinian landscape, for instance, after 1948 in several waves in the 1950s and 1960s. And Palestinian heritage and landscape could have been unprotected, among other things, because the law was not there to protect them as important sites. Another British heritage would be the fact that until today the authority looks at the landscape comprehensively as under its authority, in the meaning that everything can be, any place can be potentially protected by law, and the local occupants can be dispossessed if the site is being discovered as an important site. What I can not say about the Israeli Authority is that while the British did had, I mean, like the case of the Khanshos, when they did had interest in Islamic architecture, so they did anything to protect it. What you cannot say about the Israeli state, that basically had no let's say the institutional archaeology that had no interest in anything but biblical sites. I wouldn't say anything, of course, that would insult a lot of archaeologists in Israel who work on Islamic periods, but let's say that Mamluk would be the top interest, and then as you move backward in time, the layer of specialists, of course, is getting bigger and bigger. But let's say that the sites that receive the most lavish preservation and publications are the one that goes obviously back to biblical and obviously to the Israelite history within biblical history. So in this regard, I think there's some a lot that had been taken from the British, but not so much in terms of the specific areas of interest. Yeah.
I think I'm going to take over now. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations and the comments, Diane's comments, as well as the questions. I am aware of how much more there is as you answer the questions, both to Diane as well as to the questions from the attendants. So obviously we just opened a little window into each one of your larger research, and we're looking very much forward to seeing the completion of these dissertations, and of course we're looking forward to the books. Thank you all very much, and thank you again, the Istanbul Global Center, for making this possible. Next time, it's in February. The second webinar's title is Water, Sewage, and Horses, and it is about the infrastructure of Istanbul. Please make sure to attend that as well. Thank you. There are other question and answers. Oh, thank you. Okay, that's good. Thank you all
Thank you to
very
you,
much.
Zeynep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.